Hi, thanks for joining us for another episode of Forward Together, Adelante, Juntos.
Saludos y gracias por acompañarnos en nuestro programa. Soy su anfitriona Arelis Figueroa.
And I'm Jake Heller.
Nosotros somos líderes de la campaña de los pobres, un llamado nacional al renacimiento moral. Y nos vamos a reunir con miles de personas de todo el país para decir no más, no podemos, ya no callaremos más.
It's been a challenging few weeks for many in our communities who are having to face violence and suffering.
Las últimas semanas han sido de gran sufrimiento y dolor para muchas de nuestras comunidades alrededor de todo el país.
But on June 18th, we'll join together with leaders who are part of the 140 million poor and low-income people in this country for the mass Poor Peoples and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls. And we hope all of you will join us.
Nos reuniremos y marcharemos el 18 de junio porque cualquier nación que ignora a casi la mitad de sus ciudadanos está en una crisis moral, económica y política. Habían 140 millones de personas pobres o que estaban a una emergencia de la ruina económica antes de la pandemia.
Since March 2020, while hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions are on the edge of hunger and eviction, still without health care or living wages, billionaire wealth has grown by over $2 trillion.
En el episodio de hoy hablaremos con personas tanto de la ciudad de Nueva York, del estado, así como de otros estados, sobre el proceso de preparación para esta reunión que transformará generaciones y por qué la gente debe unirse en Washington, D.C. el 18 de junio.
We'll unite to declare the power of poor and low-wealth people and our moral allies, to say that this system is killing all of us. And we can't, we won't, we refuse to be silent anymore. But before we dive in with today's guests, we want to share a few powerful images and testimonies from the campaign's last two mobilization tour stops in Los Angeles and Memphis.
En Los Ángeles escuchamos a líderes como Lucía Torres, quien llegó a los Estados Unidos desde Guatemala hace 21 años y es organizadora de la Unión de Vecinos. Ella compartió con los presentes la historia de su esposo, quien perdió su trabajo durante la pandemia y en diciembre del 2020, al tratar de recibir tratamiento después de contagiarse con el COVID-19, el doctor le dijo que como no tenían papeles ni seguro médico, lo mejor que podían hacer era irse a la casa y morir allá. Lucía terminó su testimonio diciendo: sabemos que los inmigrantes son los ángeles y merecemos respeto y nuestros derechos.
From Los Angeles, the campaign went on to Memphis and gathered with poor and low-wealth people from Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi at the Lorraine Motel, the site where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Picking up the torch of Dr. King's final campaign, the PPC of 1968, Reverend Dr. William Barber II reminded marchers that we don't need nostalgia. We need a resurrection.
Los problemas para pagar el alquiler, encontrar un trabajo decentemente remunerado, organizar un sindicato o verse obligado a quedarse sin hogar, se encuentran entre los males que afligen a los 140 millones de personas pobres y de bajos recursos de la nación en todo el país. Estos son los males contra los que el Dr. King estaba luchando al final de su vida. Y estos son los males que la campaña de los pobres va a Washington para enfrentar hoy.
So let's turn now to June 18th and talk about why people are coming together as part of the Poor People's Campaign for a mass Poor Peoples and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington.
Vamos a ver a continuación un video del reverendo Dr. William Barber, el copresidente de la campaña de los pobres. En este video él hace un llamado contundente a esta nación y dice que tiene que arrepentirse.
A new report on COVID-19 deaths revealed that the poorest counties in the U.S. have lost twice as many people as the wealthiest counties. And in the latter waves of the pandemic, deaths have been 5 times higher in poor communities. The pandemic did not discriminate, but we did. And none of this data can be explained away by vaccination status alone. The neglect of poor and low-wealth people in this country during a pandemic was the accelerant for far too many deaths. It's immoral, shocking, and unjust, especially with the trillions of dollars that profit-driven entities received while low-wage workers were forced to go to work, called essential, but treated as expendable. We must talk about this. We must repent of this. We must cry and wail over this. We must speak out against this. We cannot say that this is because of individual choices or behavior. Something deeper is at work. Systems that prey on poor people of every race, gender, creed, color, and sexuality and region. We must compel this nation to see these realities that have been hidden for far too long. On June 18th, we will come together to lift the voices, stories, and faces of poor people and low-wage workers who know that change is not only possible, it is essential for our survival as a democracy committed to the establishment of justice for all and equal protection under the law for every person. We will make the connections to show how systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism are literally diminishing our humanity and hurting all of us. We will show the nation the faces of Americans who cannot afford to go back to normal, but who are demanding a third Reconstruction moral agenda that will move us toward a society that works for everyone. Everybody in, nobody out. Visit poorpeoplescampaign.org to get all the information you need. Forward together, not one step back.
Wow, poderoso mensaje, el del reverendo William Barber, que es el co-chair, copresidente de la campaña de la gente pobre. Recordando una vez más que este país, los Estados Unidos, tiene que arrepentirse. Como el estudio que acabamos de hacer de la campaña revela, ¿verdad?, cómo los pobres, latinos, las minorías, los inmigrantes, fuimos los más afectados por esta pandemia. Y este país, este gobierno, dejó que eso pasara y que tanta gente no tenían que haber muerto por esa pandemia. Y es por eso que nosotros vamos para Washington. Y ahora vamos a hablar con 3 líderes de nuestro movimiento. Está Ana López Lara, o Ana Lara López, está con el Cairo Center aquí en Nueva York y también coordina la movilización de los jóvenes en la campaña. Ana Blackburn, desde Carolina del Norte, y es una de las tri-chairs de Carolina del Norte. También tenemos al compañero Esvin Maldonado de Milpa. Vamos a ver más lo que es Milpa en Pensilvania, movimiento de inmigrantes en Pensilvania. Así que vamos a comenzar a conversar con ustedes. Siempre preguntamos, ¿qué les trajo a este trabajo de organización, de movilización, de activismo? ¿Qué fue lo que te trajo a este trabajo? Esvin, ¿quiere comenzar diciendo por qué está haciendo este trabajo?
Sí, bueno, buenas tardes. Antes que nada, mi nombre, como ya lo escucharon, es Esvin y trabajo con el movimiento de inmigrante de líderes en Pensilvania. Y bueno, lo que me trajo a este trabajo es porque yo vivo en el condado Franklin, en la ciudad de Chambersburg. Y cuando yo llegué a esta ciudad, pues yo noté que que hacían me faltan muchas cosas de ayuda para los inmigrantes, que no había en realidad quien se preocupara por la comunidad inmigrante. Y pues así fue como yo empecé básicamente el trabajo voluntario en esta comunidad, pero en el 2013, a raíz de que necesitábamos las licencias para manejar y que no había una organización que aquí se estuviera preocupando por eso, recibí la invitación de mi amigo Rodrigo Ortiz para una reunión para hablar acerca de las licencias. Y así fue como en ese año empezamos acá el movimiento Milpa, que pues ya era un movimiento en otras ciudades y bueno, digamos en todo el estado, pero ya habían grupos organizados en otras comunidades. En el 2013 nosotros empezamos a organizar aquí en la ciudad de Chambersburg.
Gracias, Edwin. Y este país es un país de inmigrantes. Lo construimos, lo seguimos construyendo. Así que es tan importante la organización del inmigrante. ¿Qué nos puede decir Ana Lara? ¿Qué te trajo a este trabajo?
Claro, gracias, Arelis. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Ana Lara López y a mí yo creo que siempre he sido una organizadora, siempre he tenido un interés por asegurarme que la comunidad tiene todo lo que necesite, que repartamos los recursos que tenemos y que descifremos qué es lo que se necesita y cómo nos apoyamos. Yo emigré a los Estados Unidos en el 2006 y fue en ese tiempo en secundaria donde aprendí del trabajo de la coalición de los trabajadores de Immokalee, que realmente me motivó a aprender cómo si nos organizamos desde abajo podemos lograr grandes cosas. Entonces fue a través del trabajo de ellos, el trabajo de la iglesia, mi papá como pastor, que aprendí realmente de lo que significa vivir en comunidad y de saber de ese reino que a través de la tradición cristiana, la cual yo crecí, que ese reino de Dios puede ser posible en esta tierra, en este momento. Entonces, a través de eso, pues, me comprometí a seguir trabajando por el bienestar de todos, porque sabemos que hay recursos suficientes para cubrir las necesidades de todos.
Thank you. ¿Qué nos puede decir Ana?
Buenas tardes a
Carolina
todos.
del Norte.
Soy Ana y la raza Blackburn, como dijo Arelis. Yo creo que desde el vientre de mi madre, yo he sido activista. Mi mamá era misionera y activista en la ciudad de Chicago, preocupándose por las madres y los hijos que estaban viviendo bajo los bridges y en los alleys de Chicago. Pero como vieron el video con el reverente Barber era antes de ser el co-chair del Poor People's Campaign. Él era presidente del NAACP, que se dice National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, que yo creo que se dice Asociación Nacional para el Avance de las Personas de Color. Sí. Entonces él me apuntó la primera Latina Immigrant Liaison. Wow. En los 113 años de la organización, era la primera Latino Immigrant Liaison, para poder estar seguro que coger el leadership de la comunidad afroamericana y latino y inmigrante, para estar seguro que lo estábamos juntando, porque los asuntos que afectan los afroamericanos, igual como los latinos y los inmigrantes, son casi todos iguales. Y para estar seguro que la comunidad Black y Brown se estaban uniendo. Esos son los asuntos que me trajo al activismo.
Wow, gracias. Y me encanta, y es tan importante el que siempre reafirmemos eso, el goal, ¿verdad? La meta última de nuestra campaña es unir a los pobres. Y es que los pobres, ese es el sector más desunido, ¿verdad? Como como siempre dice nuestro líder Willie Baptist, y los negros y los latinos es que tratan de desunirnos, precisamente porque a los poderosos les interesa que estemos divididos. Pero la campaña de la gente pobre también dice que todos los hechos, de alguna manera, los problemas están interconectados. Y vimos como el reverendo Barber en ese video dice que en junio 18 vamos a demostrar, ¿verdad?, esas interconexiones. Entonces quiero seguir con la pregunta de, entre todos esos hechos que sabemos que hay muchos, ¿cuál es el que más te conecta a ti con la campaña? Podemos seguir con Ana y después vamos con Esvin.
Bueno, puedo decir que por ahora sería los asuntos de la comunidad afroamericana y latinos y los inmigrantes. A mí antes el asunto era los asuntos de mujeres, pero ahora, especialmente cuando Reverendo Barber me apuntó como la primera Latino Immigrant Liaison, yo me enfoqué en los asuntos afroamericanos, latinos y inmigrantes. Esos son los que yo de verdaderamente ahora estoy bien enfocado.
¿Qué nos dice Esvin?
Sí, bueno, aparte de unir a nuestra comunidad pobre, porque somos muchos, la gente pobre, la gente con necesidades básicas. Entonces yo creo que es importante unir a esta comunidad porque juntos podemos más. Pero aparte de eso, también creo que lo que me une con esta campaña es el hecho de que estamos pidiendo una reforma migratoria para los 11 millones de personas que también somos pobres. Entonces es importante para mí y para nosotros como inmigrantes apoyar esta campaña de la gente pobre para que podamos exigir juntos una reforma migratoria y también para que podamos unirnos con la demás gente pobre que tiene necesidades básicas como lo es la salud, la falta de una buena alimentación saludable.
Gracias, sí. Somos parte de los 140 millones y más de pobres. Ana, Lara, ¿qué es lo que te conecta con este movimiento?
Y creo que parte de lo que me conecta a este movimiento es la lucha por un acceso a atención médica de calidad, la lucha a la reforma migratoria, como estaba diciendo el compañero Esvin. Mis padres como migrantes, mi mamá ha sido nanny cuidando niños y todo ese tiempo, todos esos años de trabajo sin acceso a salud de calidad. Mi padre como lavador de trastos en restaurantes también. Tanto trabajo, se te arruinan las manos con el agua caliente y no puedes tener un acceso a servicios de atención médica de calidad. Y aún a mi persona con acceso a seguro, de ahí no puedes pagar el copay de lo que tienes que pagar cuando vas a acceder a servicios médicos. Entonces creo que todos merecemos acceso a atención médica de calidad, una reforma migratoria para esos para los migrantes y como dices que somos parte de lo que sostiene la economía y la comunidad en general en este país también y una cancelación de la deuda también de los estudiantes y por eso es parte del trabajo con jóvenes que estoy haciendo yo ahora con la campaña de asegurarnos que podamos tener acceso a educación de calidad también sin tener que endeudarnos por el resto de nuestra vida.
Exacto. Sí, muy importante el trabajo con la juventud y que estamos diciendo que la campaña es, esta reunión en junio es intergeneracional y de cambio generacional. Así que es tan importante y me gusta tanto que Ana Lara esté con nosotros hoy. Entonces, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué vamos para Washington? Vamos a ver, Ana y la raza, díganos por qué la gente tiene que ir para Washington en junio 18 con nosotros.
Bueno, nosotros, para mí es bien importante que nuestra comunidad reconozca que los asuntos, como estábamos hablando, que los asuntos son, ¿cómo que se dice?
Entrelazados.
¿No? Entonces, es muy importante que nosotros reconocemos que un asunto afecta a otro asunto. Si tú no estás haciendo, ¿cómo que se dice? Si no estás haciendo un living wage, no está, entonces no puede poner comida en tu mesa, no puede poner un rufo sobre la cabeza de tu familia. Y tenemos que también reconocer, nuestra comunidad tiene que reconocer que una de las cosas que tenemos que entender es que todo esto está hecho por las leyes, por los policies. Nosotros no somos pobres porque es culpa de nosotros. Nosotros no estamos oprimidos porque nosotros hicimos eso. Estamos en las situaciones que estamos por las leyes que los líderes de esta nación siguen pasando. Y nosotros tenemos que reconocer que el poder está en las comunidades, en las personas. Y si nos unimos juntos, entonces sí que podemos levantar la agenda de nuestra gente. Y es la única manera que vamos a poder conseguir el cambio que necesitamos. Es para cambiar las leyes, y para hacer eso lo tenemos que unir. Y este tiempo es muy importante porque nosotros tenemos menos, ¿cómo dice? Derechos ahora. Y en la historia de este país tenemos mucho menos derechos en este momento. Y es por eso que es muy importante que estemos todos juntos en DC.
En pocas palabras, Ana Lara, ¿por qué tenemos que ir a Washington? ¿Por qué los jóvenes deben ir con nosotros a Washington, D.C. el 18 de junio?
Porque la deuda estudiantil está ascendiendo a 1.6 billones de dólares, que afectan a unos 44 millones de estadounidenses, mientras que la riqueza de los multimillonarios ha crecido en más de 2 billones desde el comienzo de la pandemia. Y eso es ridículo y no debería de ser así. Una nación que ignora casi a la mitad de sus ciudadanos, decimos que está en una crisis moral, económica y política. Entonces debemos, como estudiantes, como personas de muchísimos backgrounds, organizarnos y unirnos y demandar a que la situación cambie, porque hay los recursos necesarios y nos merecemos eso, lo que estamos demandando y mucho más. Entonces, por eso estamos diciéndole a los jóvenes, a los niños, a los adultos de todas las edades, que vengan con nosotros, que se reúnan y que marchemos juntos este 18 de junio en Washington, D.C.
Exactamente. Y bueno, ya no tenemos tiempo para más, pero ya vimos que Esvin dijo, vamos para Washington porque somos inmigrantes, somos pobres y tenemos que unirnos a los pobres. Gracias por haber estado con nosotros y recuerden que para unirse a nosotros y ir con nosotros, vayan a www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. Ahí va a salirle junio 18 y cómo unirse. Aquí en Nueva York tenemos ya buses y tenemos buses en casi todos los condados de gratis. Así que gracias por haber estado con nosotros y que nos vemos en DC, ¿verdad?
Así es.
Así es. Entonces, yo sé que de Milpa va un grupo bien grande. Nos vemos en DC. Gracias. Y vamos a terminar este segmento con nuestra Yara Allen. Ella es la codirectora de Teomusicología de la campaña. Y esto es del tour en Memphis. Hay una reunión en Washington. There's a meeting up in Washington.
A lot of children are going to their bed hungry. Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the streets.
Va a deportarme y separarme de mis hijos.
I can be deported and separated from my children.
The reason that we deal with poverty is because of a failure to invest in the things that all people need to live decent lives.
Welcome, everyone. Before we get to our amazing panel, I just wanted to introduce a short video from Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And she'll share with us why we won't be silent anymore.
There are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, and 700 people die a day from poverty and inequality. And this was before COVID. Poor and low-income people make up 1/3, 30% of the electorate, and we won't be silent anymore. It is time for a moral narrative shift, a moral revival, and moral action. On June 18th, the Mass Poor People's and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the Polls is that meeting. On June 18th, we will come together to lift the voices, stories, and faces of the poor people and low-wage workers who know that change is not only possible, it is essential for our survival as a democracy committed to the establishment of justice for all. We will make the connections to show how systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of healthcare, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism are hurting all of us. We will show the nation the faces of Americans who cannot afford to go back to normal. We will detail the policies that can move us toward a society that works for everyone. And we will pledge to go home and build power for transformative change in this year's election and for years to come. Join us on June 18th on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Build with us for a third Reconstruction in America. Visit poorpeoplescampaign.org.
And welcome back to our viewers and in particular our guests for today's show. Really excited to be joined by some incredible leaders from the campaign from across the country, from the Poor People's Campaign in Massachusetts and the National Union of the Homeless. We're joined by Dr. Savina Martin. Welcome.
Good to be here.
And from right here in New York City, part of the New York State Poor People's Campaign, we have Jonathan Spear. Jonathan, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And so we're approaching June 18th, mass mobilization, going to DC to make some noise and make some points. And so I thought we could just keep it pretty simple today. And I just start by asking both of you, and Jonathan, maybe we can start with you. What issues connected you to this work, to this movement, to this campaign? What brought you into the Poor People's Campaign in the first place?
Sure. So I think like many people in 2016, I heard Reverend Barber speak at the Democratic National Convention, and he talked about the need for an army of moral defibrillators. And that really stuck with me. I thought that as we do policy work, as we elect politicians, as we try to improve our society, we need a strong moral foundation. Since 1990, I've been working in education, mostly in urban and public schools. I've been involved with some phenomenal schools and a lot of innovative work. I know the transformative power of a good school, a great principal, caring teachers, but I also know that systemic change isn't going to come about unless we directly address poverty and racism and environmental degradation. And so even as I work day to day to improve schools and to work to improve outcomes for students, I'm really drawn to the campaign because I know how important it is to do this deep systemic work really confront these evils and to enable people who are doing the work in schools, for example, to be much more effective.
That's great. And it is quite shocking how little we talk about morality in our politics today. And I think that that's something that this campaign and Dr. Barber in particular really helps to center in a powerful way. We'll definitely get into that work in education in particular a little bit more in our conversation. But Savine, I also wanted to put that same question to you. You are a guest on our podcast, Getting Into Step, which folks can check out wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of your story, which is particularly powerful. So would love to know sort of how you came to this work and what brings you to the campaign.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I was a witness of my community during the social upheavals, right? And I think that was the spark that really got me involved in this work. But moreover, many years later, I got involved with the National Union of the Homeless, with a group of prolific organizers and mentors who are still around today. And of course, we are now transitioned into the unfinished work of Dr. King, which is the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. So just being a witness on the ground, growing up in a working class family, I'm part of that working poor class of women, mothers, nieces, aunts, a community, a village of folks that have witnessed both the immoral, right, economic, political devastation around homelessness and poverty. I mean, and I guess we'll get into that a little bit more later.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would love to sort of just ask you now too, because I think your story, your personal story is such a powerful example of moving from witness to activist and taking your own experiences and reflecting them back to the society that shaped them. And so I'd love if you wouldn't mind sort of talking a little bit about your own sort of personal story and why this work is, why the personal is political, as they say.
Thank you. But I have to say this. I have to say that my story is a story of hundreds of thousands of people across this country. What I witnessed, an entire community witnessed. So all of us at the same time witnessed our 15 blocks of our community burning down. All of us at the same time witnessed the disproportionate numbers of people in the community who could not get health care treatment. So my story is the story of many communities across this country, literally that today make up the 140 million that are fighting for the basic needs to survive off of. So yes, that is, it's my personal story, it's political, but what I witnessed, many other people witnessed across this country during those times. And of course, today, right? We're seeing the same thing happening over and over again. And I believe that we're seeing the power of taking matters in our own hands to advocate against systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and on by the many, many people that are getting ready to descend in Washington. So,
thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And so then, just to turn to you, Jonathan, I'd love to ask sort of what you're seeing in your day-to-day when you're working in schools, what your career has been like, what you've witnessed, and how that translates into your activism and movement work.
Yeah, well, I think that I can speak both as an educator and as a person of faith. I feel like I see day to day people working really, really hard, either as students or as teachers or administrators, really committed to the growth of the individual child and the realization of their fullest potential. And at the same time, I see that so often people's efforts are being checked by these false moral narratives about who can learn and who can't learn, and who's responsible for their poverty, and who has earned their privilege. And so as a person of good faith, I feel like I can continue to do the best that I can. And I work with people who are trying very, very hard to apply what we know about learning, what we know about students, stress and trauma, all of those factors that affect students' outcome. But we also have to combat the false moral narratives that that some people are entitled to more, and that resources are distributed fairly, and that people have to be responsible for lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps. I feel like my faith as a Jew, I think it's important that I engage and support all efforts to lift from the bottom and to serve people of different, to serve individuals and different groups with humility, with kindness and compassion.
Thank you for that. And I think it's so important to lock into these narratives that shape unintentionally in some ways, subconsciously in some ways, our individual and collective understanding of our society. And so I'd love to just ask you to elaborate a little, if you can, on how these narratives distort our morality. When you're talking about pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps, some people being responsible for their own poverty, as you said. I'd love for you to just sort of elaborate on that a little bit, if you could.
Yeah, maybe I can give a very concrete example. I've been involved in education now for 30 plus years. And during my career, we've seen basically the birth and growth of the whole charter sector. And whether you're pro-charter or anti-charter, a lot of the argument about charter schools is really predicated on the wrong questions. A lot of people are arguing about whether charter schools are good or bad, whether the people who work in them are good or bad, whether the student outcomes that we see in one school justify the existence of some schools, or whether the success of a student in one school should be used to critique another. And the reality is that the education sector writ large is wildly under-resourced. And the only reason people are fighting against each other in district schools versus charter schools is because none of them are significant or equitably funded. And so I think that's an example of where the dominant narrative is driven by these questions about which is better, X or Y, which program, which type of school, which particular leader. And the reality is that it's the wrong question to be asking, and it's driven by people who are sort of hiding behind a false moral narrative. We know what it takes to support children, to help them reach their fullest potential, and we're just not investing in education. It's not because we don't have the resources as a society, it's because we're making a choice not to invest in the future. It's not that we don't have enough resources to invest in every school. It's just that we've chosen to pit schools against each other. And these are the sorts of moral narratives that we just have to confront, and that it's necessary to confront them for us to really move forward as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that gets to the systemic nature of what you were mentioning earlier, how it's critical to be doing this work on an individual, person-to-person level, on a community level, but it's also important to be doing it on a structural and systemic level, and especially when you're talking about budgets and money and policy. And it's very convenient that there always seems to be money for certain things, no questions asked. Thinking, of course, of the military budget in particular. And then when it comes to things like funding our schools, funding housing, food, basic necessities for millions of people, suddenly there's no more money. And so, Savina, I'd love to bring you into that and ask, why now? I mean, it seems like an obvious question. There are a lot of things that are going wrong every day, it seems. But when we take a step back and we look at these sort of systemic structures that you've been fighting as an activist for decades, why now to mobilize and go down to DC on June 18th?
And why not now, right? We know that we're on the verge of a lot going on in this country, but let me start at the eviction avalanche, right? So we've got to fight against that, right? We're on the verge of homelessness becoming normalized in this country, you know, where you could take an F-18 fighter jet that costs billions of dollars and build housing for people. I mean, you know, so why not now? We have to march against the military-industrial complex that continues to take our money and put it in the war machine, right? In the war chest. So why not now? We are seeing addiction in overdoses rising in this country, and healthcare, right? Not to mention that the lack of healthcare treatment or treatment on demand to help service folks that are sleeping on the ground and addicted at the same time and cannot get the proper healthcare, but will be thrown in prison at the drop of a hat, right? So these issues that we're facing must be fought on this level. You know, this is a movement. It's not a moment. We're heading into DC and we're coming back and we're gonna fight our way to the polls, right? We have to crawl, march, chant, sing, and talk. We've got to do this. And I'm so happy that the Poor People's Campaign is doing this in DC to fight against these the horrible, immoral. I mean, you know, we had mentioned the narrative, right? Shifting that narrative earlier and blaming the people for their own poverty. And as a faith leader, I mean, and you know, Isaiah speaks about that, right? How dare you leave the women and children orphaned, and how dare you legislate these laws? Homeless folks in Massachusetts they don't have access to driver's license, and we're fighting against this bill right now, 3515, so that you have a right to have an identification so that you can have access, right? And mothers and women and children in their homes have a right to live inside of their home, but we're fighting for our own infrastructure, our own structure of gas, lights, water, food, baby formula, right? We're fighting for this, you know, to just try and live in these four walls that we cannot afford. In Massachusetts, it takes 311 hours to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So yes, we must fight against this system that is killing us, because I mean, we all have a right to live.
Absolutely, and that of course ties into issues of a living wage. You know, as people look around their cities, their communities, their society, and they see folks living on the street, it's, I think, easier to say, well, they must have done something wrong. And it's not only more accurate, but perhaps more difficult for people to look inside themselves and to look at our society and say that we did this to ourselves, and we every day are choosing to exacerbate these inequalities through laws like the one you just mentioned, preventing houseless people from getting driver's licenses, criminalizing poverty. Every day, the sweeps that we're seeing, not only now in New York, but across the country, confiscating folks' property, putting people into prisons and jails instead of actually trying to support our neighbors, our community members. And so I just wanted to give each of you one last word as we head into this mass mobilization in DC on June 18th. What do you want our viewers to know? What is motivating you? What do you think should be top of mind as we head to DC in the next couple of weeks? Jonathan, why don't we get your thoughts?
Sure. Well, just to build off of what we're talking about, in the last couple of years, we've increased the number of people who are struggling with food, with housing, with mental health needs, with medical needs. And as we go about our day, as we see our neighbor, we see someone on the subway, it's very easy to think of that person as an other. But as you're saying, we are all participating in a system that has created that person's conditions. And so it's really incumbent upon us. It's urgent for us. We have to recognize that there are at least 140 million poor people of every race, every age, distributed around in every state. We need to come together and build a broad coalition and use our collective power to demand change, and use that power in the elections and between elections to bring about real systemic change.
Thank you. Savina, I'll give you the last word.
Yes, these are unpredictable times, but there is hope in these unpredictable times. That's where you find the hope. So join us in Washington, D.C. on June 18th. It's not too late to RSVP for a bus at rally.co, and make sure you get online at poorpeoplescampaign.org and sign up today. Contact some of our state organizers if you have any questions. We're always available. But we'll see you in June 18th. And if not, we'll meet you at the polls.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us. It's been a really fantastic conversation.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
We have a crisis. A lot of children are going to their bed hungry. Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the streets.
Va a deportarme y separarme de mis hijos.
I can be deported and separated from my children.
The reason that we deal with poverty is because of a failure to invest in the things that all people need to live decent lives.
Thank you all very much for joining us.
Y gracias a todos nuestros magníficos invitados.
And thank you to the amazing group here at MNN.
Gracias por sintonizar nuestro programa.
We are organizing from Appalachia to Alabama, from Mississippi to Maine, from California to the Carolinas, and we're asking all of you to join us on June 18th as all roads lead to Washington, D.C.
Todos los caminos conducen a Washington, D.C. Nos vemos allá el 18 de junio. Forward together.
Not one step back.
Adelante juntos.
Ni un paso atrás.
We
welcome you to the launch of the Mass Poor People's Low Wage Assembly and Moral March on Washington, D.C., June 18, 2022.
are a new, unsettling force, and we are powerful. New, unsettling force, and we are here. We're rising up to demonstrate the compelling power that we, poor and low-income people, have to reconstruct society from the bottom up.
And we need to do it with the loudest voices possible, the biggest actions possible.
Because we know that there is no scarcity in this land. The only scarcity is the moral will to do what's right.
Hold on, just a little while longer.
We are those with sub-minimum wage jobs who can't afford sky-high rent.
People with disabilities are the fastest growing minority group.
It's crazy to me that in 2021, it's still legal for workplaces to pay a sub-minimum wage to people with disabilities.
There are still so much trial and tribulations that we go through as Indigenous people. We can't get a decent wage to sustain ourselves, nor can we get adequate housing.
Veterans across this nation say enough is enough. We can't pat essential workers on the back on one day and then cut their health care the next day.
Health is a political choice.
What more do I need to do to prove that my voice is just as valuable as anyone else's?
There are still forces in denial that would try to slow walk our transition to a clean economy and a just future for us all.
We have an immoral system run by immoral people.
But together we walk and we fight.
It's time for a change. Reconstruyamos esta gran nación.
See, we are people of resilience. As we fight these interlocking injustices together.
When we work together, mobilize together, and rise together, we become a voice for the voiceless, and we become an agent of change in a time where great change is needed.
We need the third reconstruction to ensure that deaf people, people with disabilities, and all people can have the right to live and to thrive.
And I declare we have work to do. It is a moral abomination that there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. It's time to give everything we have to deconstruct the interlocking injustices that are all around us. If you got gray hair, suit up one more time. If you're middle-aged and if you're young, pay your debt for living on somebody else's sacrifices. Because it's time.